That's how it is. But it's great to be here in front of you guys, and I'm glad that you spent some time with me here in the morning. Some people still coming in, that's cool. You guys can sit anywhere. It's good to be a part of this group. When they asked me to speak about NASA, I said that sounds like a lot of fun. I'm a big fan of classic history, and that's basically what NASA is all about. And when I grew up loving outer space, but to be honest, to me, it looked like this. I would wake up every morning and my dad would like Star Trek. And we would get out there and I would watch it with him, and that's what space was to me. But what I didn't realize at the time was that that was kind of shaping the future and the present. Because when that show was on the air in the 1960s, all of this was going on, and that portrayed what it could look like down the road. But what we got so far isn't too far off. We have a space station, we have space programs that have changed and evolved over the years. But what's really neat about it, though, is we actually have a lot of pretty amazing achievements today in the world. In a lot of ways, the science fiction of generations ago has become a reality. I'm sure you guys all have cell phones. Everybody has a cell phone, right? I mean, I do. It's a pretty nice new device. But when Captain Kirk was using a cell phone for the first time, when we look at it now, it seems like a glimpse into maybe a low-budget series from a simpler time. But technology like that didn't exist as kids for me. It wasn't always there. It was developed and created. When I was younger, I know we're kind of a generation apart, you guys, but I would always talk into my wrist on the playground with the other kids, and we'd pretend to be Power Rangers, and we would teleport, and we would have some fun, and we would fight the bad guys. But now you can get Samsung watches and Apple watches, just like anything else. Anybody have one of those? Like, we've all seen them. You all know what they look like. And that particular device exists now. And it's hard to believe, you know, that technology's in stores everywhere. Even the TVs that people used to watch took up entire rooms of their homes back in that time period. Now we can play them right on our phones, on YouTube, Netflix, Hulu, and other programs. And all those programs are really pretty sophisticated. And we live in a world where pretty much everything is within reach, thanks to that technology that we have in our electronic devices. But for me, at least in my opinion, there was never really a time that was filled with more achievement and sort of more the spirit of adventure than the space age. Ooh, fancy. Now, the space age sounds pretty retro, right? When you hear terms like space age, you usually think of cars with giant fins on them, furniture from the 1960s that doesn't look very comfortable but looks like it would go great on a spaceship, and robot butlers. I don't know where my robot butler is. They told me in 2001 that we were going to have one. Other things happened. It didn't happen. I don't understand. But it was a simpler time. It was an innovative time. But in an effort to compete with Russia, it's always Russia, in an effort to compete with Russia for domination of the final frontier, America truly came together to root for the newest organization. That, of course, was NASA. NASA, as you probably know, stands for the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, and it was actually funded and formed in 1958 by President Eisenhower. And it was formed out of the remnants of a former National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics. It was a group that actually existed since 1915. Here's a rare picture of them taking the sign down for the NACA, NACA, I guess. I don't know if they ever said NACA, I wasn't there. But it was one of those things that focused not on the stars, but they worked on Earth-based technology advancement. And when they discovered we need to go to the moon, we need to go to space, they said we need to reform this committee and we need to come together and do something new. And they were able to do just that. And by the time John F. Kennedy became president in January of 1961, Americans had the perception that the United States was losing the space race to Russia. Losing the space race to Russia, that was huge. And they continued to feel that way because in 1957, the first satellite was launched, and it was a Russian satellite called Sputnik. And Americans were scared. They have a satellite in space. What are they going to do? How are they spying on us with that satellite? And it turns out that Sputnik couldn't do much of anything, but it was orbiting the Earth, and it scared people, which makes sense, I suppose. Russia continued to dominate in the space race by sending the first man into outer space. And let's face it, who wants to be second? The first man in space was Yuri Gagarin. He orbited the planet Earth in a vehicle called the Vostok 1 in April of 1961. And when you think about it, America could have gone first. Our first astronaut was ready to go, and it was weeks away from happening. But they wanted more tests. Safety was important, and it still is. But to be that first astronaut and sit back and see kind of a chimpanzee take your place, and then another man beat you to the punch, that's okay. That's okay. It happens. But the time had finally come for NASA to establish that presence in space for itself. The new NASA had its work cut out for them, and what quickly became the Mercury Project. They saw this, and you notice on the side it says, "So close, yet so far, size Cape." They were all set to go at Kennedy Space Center, but it didn't happen first. It happened, but it didn't happen first. And America knew that they needed not only a great team of astronauts, but they needed a great publicity setup for this, because they needed to know that, yes, America is going to dominate in this space race. And that's where these men come into the picture. They make their mark on history. The first group of astronauts, Astronaut Group 1, also known as the Mercury 7. They make their mark on history in a variety of ways. But in the back row, you'll see Alan Shepard, Gus Grissom, and Gordon Cooper. In the front row, Wally Schirra, Deke Slayton, John Glenn, and Scott Carpenter. It's kind of funny to think this photo was the only time they all wore their spacesuits together, because, again, they wanted to publicize, we have men who are going into space, and this is the beginning of a huge space fleet. And so these 7 astronauts, if you notice, the 2 in the middle, one of them being John Glenn, they have spray-painted work boots on. Clearly they put this together in a hurry. But they said, we need people to know that we're doing this. Everything Russia did in the space race was kind of secret. They were out there doing things behind the scenes and kind of sneaking satellites and people into space. Everything America did was publicized on every network. Every channel, every newspaper outlet would talk about what our space program was doing. And that was both good and bad, I suppose, because if we wanted to beat the Russians, we probably shouldn't tell them every single thing that we did. But, you know, that's a strategy, and it works one way or the other. But I think the most important thing to the American people back then wasn't even going to the moon. It wasn't even winning the space race. It wasn't even beating Russia. It was having a sense of American pride and accomplishment. And now, these 7 astronauts that you see here were the best of the best, as you would probably imagine. If any of you have ever thought about being an astronaut, it's always a possibility. I always say reach for the moon. It's definitely one of those things. But 508 graduates of test pilot schools got their service records given to the U.S. Department of Defense. And from them, 110 people met the criteria to be astronauts. And that's just the minimum standards. They wanted people who were less than 40 years old, so they'd have some longevity in the program. They had a bachelor's degree or equivalent. And they were no taller than 5'11". Now, all of those were negotiable except the last one, because you can probably guess why. Those space capsules aren't very big. And I can't imagine really going into space in a vehicle with no more room than this podium. But these guys did it. They were the first pioneers to make it happen. And the team experienced probably more media coverage than any other thing from its time period. None of the actors that were doing movies and television, none of the sports stars were getting covered as much, because as a nation we wanted to show we were better than Russia. And this was the way to do it. NASA was going to win, both in space and in the ratings. So before too long, NASA was ready to send their first test pilot up to the final frontier. And after a lot of testing, deliberation, some dumb luck, they selected Alan Shepard to be the first, because he was, of those 7, the one who was the smartest. He had the highest aptitude, the highest IQ, and they thought that they wanted someone to do this for the first time who could think on his feet and really control things if anything went wrong. So Shepard was a naval officer from New Hampshire. I want to give you a little background on him just because he was the first man in outer space from the United States. He easily passed all the entrance exams when he was 16 years old. 16 years old, and he passed all the naval entrance exams. Of course, when they found out he was 16, they said, it's not going to fly, literally. So they put him through an academy. The Navy suggested an academy for him. He went to that academy, and then he trained in aviation. He eventually did join the Navy and served on board the USS Cogswell. And at the time, it was the Navy's requirement for people to spend some time at sea if they were going to go into the aviation program. kind of one of those things where they say, yeah, we'll let you be an aviator, but you got to do something for us. So they started out doing just that, and he was at sea. While he was there, though, on board the USS Reno, there he is getting married. That's awesome. Good times, huh? So when he was on board the USS Reno, he actually, I'm sorry, he was on the USS Cogswell. Get my notes mixed up, my apologies. But he was on the USS Cogswell, and he rescued the USS Reno. He and his crew rescued 172 sailors after a Japanese attack during World War II. All of this is before he did anything relating to NASA or flying. So that's the character of the men that they selected to go into outer space. So someone who had rescued selflessly 172 sailors from another vehicle prior to even joining the NASA program. Then it came time for his flight 23 days after the Soviet successful orbit of the planet. On May 5th, 1961, it's an important day, Alan Shepard became the first American in space. And it kind of sounds like it's a silver medal prize, right? Second in outer space. But it's actually pretty cool. And NASA was on their way to something great. I got a quick video clip I want to show you. Kind of crazy, the news broadcast from that time period. It's like a little epic mini movie of itself. I thought that was pretty neat, and not the best quality, of course, but I was really glad that I found that and I could share something like that. It's pretty unique to get to go on a voyage like that. Let's take a moment to look at the capsule Shepard used to go into space. He took off on a Mercury Redstone 3, which was the missile that you see on the screen there. And here's a little bit of information about that particular missile. It wasn't very comfortable. Look at this. If you got strapped onto the front of a rocket, like one of these right here, it doesn't sound like very much fun to me. And there's like a 1 in 5 chance of that rocket exploding, and they'd seen it happen many times prior to that. So when you get in the capsule, which is only that big, right there, see if I can pause this again. See if I can get that to pause. If not, that's fine. We'll just keep going back and forth. The ballistic capsule here had a lot of different features to it, but really only room for one thing to happen. He had to know how everything worked. There was a heat shield for re-entry, an attitude controller, escape initiator, a couch. You gotta have a couch. It's comfortable in there. But Alan Shepard, as you can see, as he went into the capsule, didn't have a lot of space. Did not have a lot of space, but he took off, he made it on his mission, and he was picked up by a nearby aircraft carrier when it was all said and done. So technically, in every way, the mission was a success. The mission was a pretty big success. He also had tested the retro rockets on board the vehicle for a later mission, because the important thing was the next and the next and the next succeed. And that's what was going to happen with these astronauts right here. I'll take it back here. And I just thought it was pretty neat to find out information about all this. It's pretty cool to see how it worked. Even though it was a technical success in every way, the mission had been scrubbed multiple times. They had the first window of opportunity to launch in April, and had they done that, Shepard would have been the first man in space and not the second. So with something like that, it was one of those things that people didn't know was going to happen. The second attempt was Gus Grissom on the Liberty Bell 7. He survived that flight just fine, but the capsule was lost. They later recovered the capsule and pulled it out of the water. It was a success, though, and NASA did press on. Now that they had 2 people go into space without orbiting the planet, it was John Glenn's turn to make his mark on history. I know you guys have heard of John Glenn quite a bit because he just recently died not too long ago on December 8th. But Glenn was a test pilot and a hero. He was an American hero who served the Korean War on 149 different combat missions. He married his sweetheart of 73 years. She was actually a friend of, the daughter of a friend of his mother's. They knew each other as toddlers. They got married. And I guess this is one case where they lived happily ever after. And which isn't true of a lot of astronauts, really. Because when they put the mission first, a lot of families were broken. A lot of things happened that way. But it didn't happen that way for John Glenn. So who's this? That's Kennedy. Okay, we'll go back. Here we go. So here he is getting into the Friendship 7 to be the first man to orbit the Earth, which he did on February 22nd, 1962. After 3 orbits, we knew that things were going well. And Glenn was again a hero. See, things were finally successful for NASA, and the American people finally felt a sense of pride again, an accomplishment. There were some more tests, including Scott Carpenter's flight on the Aura 7, and Gordon Cooper, right here, became the first man to sleep in space during a 22-orbit mission that he took. It was September of 1962, however, when President Kennedy gave one of his most famous speeches. And if you've heard anything from Kennedy, you've probably heard this speech. It's called The Address at Rice University on the Nation's Space Effort. But historically, it's remembered much more simply as "We choose to go to the moon." We're going to do what? It's crazy, right? If you think about that, it's an era where very, very few things have been tried. And the idea of going to the moon is revolutionary in any time period. Think about that. But here, only a handful of people had even been into outer space in any way. Only a couple had even orbited the planet. Going to the moon was almost impossible, but here the president made a bold statement. And the thing about Kennedy is he was the kind of president you just wanted to impress. You wanted to do the thing Kennedy wanted. And he was a great man and a great leader. And to make things more stressful on a country who was just building its space program for the first time, tragedy, of course, would strike on November 22nd of 1963. President Kennedy, a great man, of course, was one of the nation's most hopeful leaders. And with his loss in Dealey Plaza in Texas, things seemed a little bit different. An era of innocence, if you will, was starting to come to an end. Things were uncertain for the space program. Things were uncertain for the state of our union. But luckily, President Johnson had always been one of the key cheerleaders for the space program, for lack of a better word. He wanted it in the very beginning from Dwight Eisenhower. And he vowed to make President Kennedy's goal of going to the moon in this decade. In that decade. That left them 8 years to go from no program at all to going to the moon. And you guys probably know with government or with anything, change takes time. It doesn't happen overnight. And to build these things and make up these things, and there wasn't really a textbook on it. You couldn't go out and say, oh, we're going to go to the moon, so we need this rocket to do this and that and this and that. It didn't happen. Everything was trial and error. And we had to make going to the moon a reality. Getting to the moon required more extensive testing, as you might imagine. Specifically, how to operate and dock other vehicles in outer space. And that was what started Project Gemini. Project Mercury was a success, but the Gemini missions were going to show people could live and do things in outer space. Going to the moon would take 10 days. So mankind had to learn to live in outer space. A new group of 9 astronauts joined the Mercury 7. In this group, a couple of possibly familiar faces: Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin. Also in this picture, the rookie John Young. He and Gus Grissom from the first group were the first team of 2 to travel together on Gemini 3. It was the first time 2 people had ever been to space together. And their only mission was to go up and come back alive. Luckily they succeeded. That's fantastic, right? But think about that. When your mission is go and come back safely, all you need to do, test some of the instruments along the way, but just don't blow yourselves up. It's crazy, right? To think about it. Who's going to sit on the top of that rocket? But they did it, and it was a new mission, and they returned alive. It was a Titan missile this time. It was a rocket with enough firepower, but a very low success rate. Just like with the previous rockets, 1 in every 5 Titan missiles failed. So, you know, if you launch 1, you launch 2, do you launch the 3rd one? How does it go? A lot more extensive training and fine-tuning was needed, and they eventually got that. But it became the difference between life and death. March 23rd of 1965, however, they made it happen. They took off, Gus Grissom and John Young. But they landed off target because they forgot to calculate the rotation of the Earth upon re-entry. It's kind of weird to think about, right? They make all these calculations and they forget that. Luckily, they landed somewhere safely, and they were okay, at least for the time being, on all counts. The next big challenge was the EVA. Of course, that's extravehicular activity for these guys. And Gemini 4 saw Ed White, the gentleman you see on the screen there, take the first spacewalk. The thing about the spacesuits is there was only one way to test them, and that was in space. We could do the testing underwater, and they did. They did plenty of testing underwater, but you don't know what the vacuum of space is going to do until you're out there. So Ed White took the risk. He went out and was the first man to walk in space. And once it was proven to work, Gemini 7 launched on December 4th with Frank Borman and Jim Lovell at the helm. See, what that would do is the lunar lander there would eventually have to rendezvous with another part of the vessel if mankind was going to go to the moon. We'll talk about how the moon stuff works a little bit later. But they knew that two things would have to rendezvous together in space. So they had to start testing that. That's why they had two Gemini rockets go together and rendezvous with one another. 2 missiles were needed for the launch. 3 days after Gemini 7 was launched, Gemini 6 was launched. There were a few issues with that rocket, though. It delayed it another 3 days. That's all the stuff. So these guys who had now planned to be in space for X amount of time had added 3 more days to their journey. It's crazy to think about. Oh, guys, we're going to need you to stick around up there for a little while longer. Okay. We didn't have Netflix. Couldn't catch up on the favorite shows. But they could look at the Earth, and I assume that didn't get old. Maybe it did. I wasn't there. But they did that for another 3 days. Mission Control couldn't do anything but wait and see if the pilots could fly in formation. Again, these were some of the best test pilots on Earth, but we're in space now. It's a game changer. Also, the spacecraft, if they're orbiting Earth, we're traveling at 17,500 miles an hour. That's the typical speed that it takes to orbit the Earth, and you don't have a lot of room for mistakes when you're going that fast and you're in a weightless environment. So that's just the way it would go. Gemini 8 would be the first to actually connect for the first time in space. That mission was commanded by Dave Scott and Neil Armstrong. You'll see them on the screen. I'm sure you've heard of Neil Armstrong for another reason that we'll talk about soon. See, one of the thrusters on the capsule got stuck, however, when they were docking with a piece of Agena, which they left up there, another piece from the rocket to dock with. And when that thruster got stuck, they started kind of spinning out of control. The roll rate went up at an alarming rate. Armstrong himself took command of the vehicle, powered up the engines to compensate, saved the pod and the crew, but it forced the mission to be aborted before it was completed. And more of these missions took place, and it just proves that quick thinking is really the only way they could get through that. And they did. While it was spinning out of control at that speed, 17,500 miles an hour, I don't know if you've ever spun out of control in a car, but you don't want to do that at 40 miles an hour. Doing it at 17,500 miles an hour is likely, the G-forces alone, to cause an instant blackout. Luckily, Armstrong was able to fire that rocket and just maneuver the ship enough to keep them stable. They were able to break off and come back to Earth. This is stuff in the morning, they didn't know how it was going to go. They didn't know it was going to happen. But all things considered, it was a completely successful mission, and the moon, again, seemed within reach. Now we could dock with other things in outer space. That was fantastic. And it was time now to think about the Apollo missions. So we had Mercury, then Gemini. Now it's time for Apollo. Man would go to the moon in this decade. That's what he said. That's what we had to do. The Apollo missions required another kind of rocket. That would be the Saturn rocket. It was developed by German-American scientist Wernher von Braun, who had formerly worked for Germany during World War II. That's how they would do it. After World War II, Germany was the bad guy. We knew that. But both Russia and the United States scrambled to get as many different scientists as they could. It was, they knew that science could be used as a weapon if they wanted to. And Dr. von Braun was, in fact, on the side of using science as a weapon. But when he was brought to America, he helped propel these astronauts to outer space. So I guess there's that. Testing began immediately on the new rockets, the Saturn rockets, and the flight crew for the first manned mission to the moon was assembled. The first astronauts on the moon were going to be Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee. That's Wernher von Braun. I forgot to put his picture in there. There he is. But these are the first 3 astronauts to go to the moon. Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee. And sadly, those 3 names didn't go down in history as being the first men on the moon. They're remembered for some of their other missions, the spacewalk, but they're also remembered for the tragedy that would soon befall them. On January 27th of 1967, they were doing a routine test of their capsule. It wasn't on the rocket, it wasn't set to take off, nothing like that was going to happen. But a fire in the command console claimed the lives of all 3 of those space pioneers. It was the first major disaster NASA ever faced. Wouldn't necessarily be the last. But for the first time, people thought, this is scary, this is serious, what are we going to do? Is the space program going to continue? The command module was built by North American Aviation. And the prototype for those space capsules would eventually lead to being the lunar capsule that they took to the moon. The module was larger than the ones flown by Mercury and Gemini, and they were the first designed specifically for that rocket. But because they hadn't been tested, that's what they were doing. It was an easy test, but it proved to be fatal for our astronauts. Here's a news clip from that tragedy. I guess it's part of acceptable risk when you're doing the impossible. But test pilots were always like that. They would probably be some of the cockiest people you ever saw. But they knew that that was part of the business. And if they went out in a blaze of glory, pun intended I suppose, they did what they loved. They wanted to do what they did, so they did. So things were dark. It was less than 3 years left in the decade here, and there was so many more tests to do, so many more things. Would men make it to the moon in time? Only time would tell. Apollo 7 would be the next time man went into space. The failure, for lack of a better word, loomed over NASA for a short period of time. But believe it or not, they wanted to keep going. Everybody wanted to keep going. Because that's what Gus would have wanted, that's what Ed and Roger would have wanted. And that's inevitably what happened. So Apollo 7 would be the next time man went into space, and that actually included the first live broadcast from outer space. Another time the whole world was watching. Apollo 8, you see their tiny, their logo, was the first to achieve a lunar orbit. First time anyone ever achieved lunar orbit was Apollo 8. Apollo 9 would test the lunar module for the first time. But it was Apollo 10 that was the dress rehearsal. The manned lunar module was piloted to within 8.4 miles of the lunar surface, and then the team returned without landing. The astronauts in question on this mission were Eugene Cernan, John Young, and Tom Stafford. Think about that though. You go all that way, you're 8 miles from the surface of the moon, and Capcom tells you to turn around and come back to Earth. That's you knew that was going to happen. It was all a test. But you get that close to the moon, you want to reach out and touch it. But it wasn't their turn yet. Luckily, Gene Cernan and John Young would both get a chance to go see it in person a little bit later. Of course, that might be the right thing to do, right? Let them work out the kinks, then we'll go back to the moon when the time is right. But next came Apollo 11. Oh, that's the last two guys I was talking about, Gene Cernan and them. But they're pretty cool. Next came Apollo 11. That's when history was finally made. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, along with their pilot Michael Collins, who doesn't get remembered as often because he didn't walk on the moon, but it was just as important that Michael Collins be there. They made their historic journey, and on July 20th, 1969, the Apollo lander made its descent to the Sea of Tranquility on the moon, overcoming some navigation errors, overcoming computer alarms. They knew it was time to be the first men on the moon. Astronauts Armstrong and Aldrin took the very first spacewalk on live television in direct vicinity of their lunar lander. So man made it to the moon. That's exactly what we wanted to have happen, and it's what happened. History was made. Televisions across the world were tuned into that moment. Everyone in every country, so I'm told, was there to watch this historic moment. America won. They did it. We were the first people to walk on the moon. The space race was officially won. And what would happen next? There's more to see from some of these Apollo missions in the future. Even though that one was the absolute most historic, Apollo 12 was actually struck by lightning twice during its launch. Think about that. And they had a brief loss of fuel cells and telemetry, but they performed the first precise moon landing. They saw Armstrong, actually they saw Michael Collins do it, then they were able to do it a little bit easier. In 2 different moonwalks, astronauts Pete Conrad and Alan Bean recovered portions of the Surveyor 3, which was an old moon probe. They picked some of those pieces up to bring back to Earth to see not only what the effects of them being on the moon had done, but just to have some history back as well. Next came Apollo 13. Many of you have probably heard of Apollo 13 as the one that got away. The mission was aborted after an oxygen tank exploded on a trip to the moon. And you don't get a lot of leeway when something like that happens. The landing had to be canceled, and they were literally coming up with a way to save these astronauts' lives on the fly. Thousands of people back on Earth, excuse me, along with the 3 astronauts themselves, whose only goal at that point was survival. That was all they could do, was try to find a way to stay alive. After a single loop around the moon, though, the lunar module itself was used in sort of an unorthodox way as the lifeboat for a safe return. The 3 astronauts on board are remembered quite well: John Lovell, Frank Hayes, and Jack Swigert, partially because of their inclusion in the movie Apollo 13, where they were played by Tom Hanks, Bill Paxton, and Kevin Bacon. One of my friends from Orlando, when I was out there, actually had the opportunity to hear Lovell speak at one point at a school. And everybody would ask, how true was that movie? How close to action was that movie? And he would say that only a few things were added for Hollywood dramatic effect. But overall, it was exactly what you saw on screen. That's what happened. It took that kind of ingenuity, that kind of quick thinking, and truthfully, that kind of heroics to save the lives of the crew. Let's see the real ones here again. These guys here deserve a little more fame. Apollo 14, 15, and 16 were all successful missions as well, but by now, like I said, America won the space race with Apollo 11. The world had sadly turned their attention away from the space program. Russia lost the space race, and that was enough. That's all they needed to know. But in all, 12 men can say they landed on the surface of the moon. Some were test pilots, some were scientists. On the last mission, Apollo 17, scientists went. Hundreds of lunar samples were brought back each and every one of those times. And in December of 1972, Harrison Schmitt and Gene Cernan left the moon. And we never went back. Harrison Schmitt there, as you can see, and Gene Cernan. Schmitt, the one with the beard. Apollo 18 and 19 were originally planned, but the missions were scrubbed to save money. Today, 45 years later, Apollo hardware sits abandoned on the moon. Relics from a bygone era. Some people miss the glory days of space exploration, while others think the missions never even happened. Children inspired by the moon landing grew up to have children, and even grandchildren of their own. It's crazy to think about. Space exploration will continue, though, with more challenges to overcome and more missions to complete. Several manned space stations, such as Skylab that you see on the screen, were built both by Russia and the United States. Today, well not today, but after that, the Space Shuttle program had a total of 5 shuttles and saw 135 successful missions. This was the first of the space shuttles that was never actually meant to achieve orbit, but only be used for testing. And this is the Space Shuttle Enterprise. They named that after the Star Trek series because they were so inspired by what happened. Bless you. They were so inspired by what happened in that situation. Most notably, the space shuttles, which were used between 1981 and 2011. I was lucky enough to be at the very last launch of Atlantis in 2011. They saw the launch of the Hubble telescope. There we go. They saw the construction of the International Space Station. And today that station is roughly the size of an American football field, and it orbits the Earth every 90 minutes. Over 15 countries work together on the scientific research facilities on that station, including Russia and the United States. So after all this time, and all the conflict that we still have on Earth, Russia and the US can work together, even if it's all the way up there. So that's good to know. But the final mission of the Space Shuttle Atlantis was over 6 years ago. So that kind of begs the question, what's next for NASA? We have a small answer about that. I know you guys got to get going soon, but in the early 2020s, NASA hopes to continue pushing the boundaries of space exploration by sending the first humans to another planet. The hope of mankind going to Mars is very, very unique. It's captivating, it's awe-inspiring, and it's no different than the moon missions of the 60s and 70s. And the Orion multi-purpose vehicle has been built to do just that. So that's a quick look at what Orion might look like. Everyone, I want to thank you for joining us on Facebook Live. And I want to thank you guys who are still in the room for being here today. Inspire yourselves, do great things, because what we didn't talk about today were the hundreds and thousands of scientists on Earth who made all of those missions a reality. So using science, technology, engineering, and math, people went to the moon. And people can go back if you stay inspired and follow your heart and work in those fields. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a great day.